Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, based on where you are joining from. Welcome to the second workshop organized for the Smart Move Challenge under the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs, supported by NIUA, GIZ India, and Cities Forum. For today's workshop, we have an amazing speaker, Mr. John Barry, who will be sharing his experience and knowledge on how data plays an important role in achieving sustainable transportation and building world-class public transportation for people. But before I introduce John, I would request Shalendra, who is the co-founder of Cities Forum and one of the organizers of the challenge, to set the context by telling us a bit about the Smart Move Challenge. Over to you, Shalendra.
Hi everyone. First of all, greetings for the new year 2021. I hope every one of us we will have a safe new year 2021. So with this note, let me take you through the smart move bit of a background in terms of what we are doing under the challenge. So maybe some of you have already attended our previous workshop. So let me just project my screen for a moment, if you can bear with me. Yeah, so this is the challenge we are working on. It's called Smart Move. It's a global challenge which basically we are working to help unlock the potential of urban mobility dataset in Indian cities. So as you know, Indian cities, rather, all the world cities, they are facing a lot of challenges because of COVID-19 crisis, and Indian cities typically, because of mixed nature of traffic, they are facing a lot of mobility challenges. So this challenge aims at proposing the solution to address the mobility concerns which Indian cities are facing. So it's a global challenge. So the challenge is basically under two categories. Category one is for the student. So if you are a student, you can participate under the student category of the challenge. And recently we have opened up the challenge for a wider participation. So even if you are a professional working in any corporate sector or a startup or any company, so you can also participate under the challenge and submit your concept note. The whole journey for the challenge is basically around 6 month time, and we are in the first stage of concept note submission. And while the participants are preparing the concept note, we basically got this kind of idea that let us do some kind of knowledge sharing workshop where we invite the eminent speakers who are working in different field, and then they share their experience that how within their job they basically use the data sets to evolve some smart solutions for addressing mobility concerns. So this challenge is under various government of India scheme like Smart Cities Mission or Self-Reliant Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan or Clean India Mission and Digital India Mission. So the entire challenge is structured across three main theme areas. So first is the restoring public transport ridership. And under restoring public transport ridership, we are calling solutions under two sub-themes. One is, how the public transit agency can come up with the COVID-19 crisis. So we welcome the solutions from the participant that how to address this problem. Second is how to build the cost efficiency in public transit system. So these are the two areas where participants are working, and we started receiving a lot of queries on this issue. The second is an important area in achieving the sustainable transport and resilience. So in this particular theme, we are looking at two sub-themes, which is multimodal integration. So you can propose some kind of technology solution that how we can achieve a multimodal integration in India or Indian cities being, if the character of Indian cities, you have multiple modes. So how we integrate these modes together in order to achieve a sustainable transport solution. So this is an area where we are seeking the solution. And the fourth one or the second sub-theme under this is sustainable transport. So you can suggest some solution in order to build the sustainable transport solutions for Indian cities. The third theme is equity in mobility, where we are looking gender and safety and inclusivity. So within these six sub-theme or three theme areas, so we are welcoming the ideas and suggestions from teams globally, whether you are an individual or you can participate in a team. So we are a bit flexible in terms of designing this whole challenge. And another important thing which we have actually considered in this challenge, because these solutions need to be for the cities. So there will be an active involvement of various Indian cities while we design or while we have this process of smart move. So at this stage, we are calling participant to submit the concept note. Then based on the shortlisted concept note, there will be a matchmaking event between the cities and the participant, where the shortlisted team will given an opportunity to present their ideas to various cities in India, and they can choose based on their priority or their project pipeline or their immediate concern. They can choose that I would want to work with this particular team. Then from that point onward until the final proposal submission, the team and the city will work together, and the smart move organizer will provide some mentoring session wherein we will call industry expert, and other academic expert or subject matter expert who will parallelly working with these team in refining their solution. And then the final solution will be submitted to the organizer, and after that the final solution, the top 3 or 4 teams will be finalized for the final selection. So the whole challenge, this is the timeline which has been recently revised. So we are calling the concept note submission by 17th of January. So this is the second workshop as part of this knowledge sharing structure which is designed under the smart move. And from 17th of January, we will announce the shortlisted concept note in a period of two weeks, where in February 8th, we will announce. And March 1st, we are organizing a matchmaking event with the partnering cities. And by 12th of April, you will have to submit the final solution. So from now onward, the team will have 4 month time to submit the final solution. And from now until the 4 month, there will be series of knowledge sharing session like this will be held with these particular teams, and those will be more specific to their solutions. So right now we are calling, these are general knowledge sharing session, like first one which we did, where the expert from Hong Kong has joined us, and then he has shared his experience that how Hong Kong public transport system has gone into a complete transformation changes. So today we've called John from London. So he's basically sharing his experience that how he has addressed the concern which London public transport system was facing using the data. So this is the whole idea about the challenge. So with this particular note, now I will hand over the stage to Abhishek so that he can then introduce John, and then John can talk about his experience. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Shailendra. Without taking much time, I would now like to introduce John Barry. So, John is an independent consultant working with cities around the world on bus network strategy and operations. John was head of bus network development at Transport for London until 2017, responsible for planning the city's bus service during a period when usage levels were transformed through coordinated passenger-led improvements. Prior to working in transport, John was a mathematics teacher. He is based in London. So in today's presentation, John will share insights on how data were used in delivering London's bus improvements. A key message will be the need to understand data's role within the wider context of relationships and processes present in your organization. John will show us detailed examples of data in action from London, concluding with general advice applicable in any context. Over to you, John.
Thank you very much. And hello to everybody, wherever you are. I'm in London this afternoon, and you're very welcome, and thank you for listening to me. My experience is with London's bus service, and my remarks will therefore focus on that. But I believe the things I have to say are of general applicability to whatever mode of transport you might be working with. I'm now going to show you the slides. Somebody will let me know if they're displaying. I see they're appearing now. Can they go into slideshow mode? So, as Shailendra said, I started off as a teacher a number of years ago now. I'm now moved on from Transport for London, where I worked for many years, not quite in the era of horse buses, but almost. And I'm now looking at similar problems in cities like Dublin, Bucharest, and Manila in the Philippines. We are here today to talk about the overall theme of multimodal integration and sustainable transport. I want to give you some thoughts that might help you with the challenge of coming up with a winning idea. I want to talk about context. Certainly the things I've been talking about here are implementable and scalable. They deliver things on time and they're practical. They've been financed and there are verifiable outcomes. So we will talk about how a data-powered approach helped transform London's bus service. First, some remarks about Transport for London. It's an executive agency of the Mayor of London with statutory powers and responsibilities across all the modes of transport: trams, the river, the Docklands Light Railway, ferries, bicycle hire, congestion charging, railways, the underground, services for the mobility impaired, walking and cycling, taxis, and of course buses. The Mayor of London is required to write a transport strategy. The last one was produced in 2018. It's still valid. Obviously the pandemic will affect everyone in how they implement their strategies, but the themes here are still valid. Theme 1 of 3 is healthy streets for healthy people. In the London context, a healthy street means one that's designed for walking, cycling, and public transport users. And this design is supported by applications of data-powered techniques across all the modes. I'm showing on this picture just a few of them. If you look to the left of the picture, you'll see the entrance to a tube station. Journey planning is critical for people's use of the tube. And research from 2017 found that 42% of Londoners were using a Journey Planner app based on TfL open data. Secondly, reading up, road network reconfiguration is a big theme in London now. I'm circling there a street that's been converted for walking and cycling use only. Obviously that has big implications for traffic assignment, and TfL uses network-wide traffic management driven by large volumes of data from the traffic signaling system and other sensors to manage that reconfiguration of the road network. Thirdly, bus service reliability, my theme today, totally dependent on data-driven management techniques. And lastly, in this small selection, electric vehicles. One of the things that is available now in London, based on TfL's open data, is an app that will tell you where your nearest available electric vehicle charging point is. The other two themes of the Mayor's transport strategy are supporting new homes and jobs and a good public transport experience. I'm showing there the map of the Elizabeth line, formerly known as Crossrail, and an image showing some of the new homes and offices that such projects will enable and are enabling already. These are also totally driven by data and good information. Next, the organisational context for bus service delivery. There is a delivery chain for buses in London, and this applies generally. The purpose of the chain, I show here, is to convert strategy on the left into service outcomes on the right. And in cities where the chain works well, there is a clear allocation of responsibilities along the chain. You have a system owner who has a strategic focus, a system manager who has a network focus, and operator focus. In London, those entities are the Mayor, who sets strategy and chairs the Board of Transport for London and sets fares. Transport for London, which does the service planning and tendering, monitors the outputs and quality, organises communications with passengers and stakeholders, runs the revenue and ticketing systems, and provides all the bus stops, stations, automatic vehicle location system and radio. And lastly, the operators, who produce the service by tendering to TfL for contracts, running to TfL standards, employing the operating staff, and owning the operating infrastructure, the buses and the garages. This is just for reference when you look back to show who does what amongst those three entities in respect of network, staff, vehicles, infrastructure, fares, and customer service. TfL is a diverse organisation with all its responsibilities. That's the top level of the organisation chart as it stood at the end of last year. The TfL Commissioner is in charge, and there are various departments. I've highlighted surface transport and customer communications and technology because those departments are principally involved in bus operations, but also you will see there the underground, walking and cycling, and the various back office functions like HR and finance. Highlighting surface transport, the breakdown there is, again, with the bus parts highlighted, a strategy team and innovation team, bus operations, transport policing, service planning for bus and rail, an organisation responsible for the contracts for the overground, the Docklands Light Railway and the tram, in other words, all the non-underground rail services in London. Vision Zero, which is to reduce killed and seriously injured incidents to zero by the 2030s. Projects team and network management, which is responsible for running the Transport for London road network. And the bus activities that go on in CCT, the technical services such as the automatic vehicle location system, the ticketing equipment and the radios, and information and customer contact. Bus operations, safety, central control and tendering and contract management and performance monitoring, in service planning and strategy, and in network management, bus station infrastructure and bus stops. So even within TfL, a number of places where the buses are being transformed from, and people thinking about data, I always think have to be very careful to make sure that their understanding of what data and what information is being produced fits in with the context organisationally of the organisation they're working with. It can be very easy for bits of data to be in one part of the organisation and not in another part that needs them. Finally, for context, service planning involves not only external relationships, shown with the blue circles here, with developers, central government and local government and passenger groups, but also internal relationships for the shorter term planning to the left with the bus and train operators, managing reliability, changing timetables and schedules, dealing with roadworks. And for the longer term, with what in London is called the City Planning Department, which deals with the big land use changes to make sure that the bus network and its infrastructure continue supporting those. So a number of relationships, internal and external, involving flows of data and information, even in one of the functions, the service planning function. How does the data support bus service delivery? There are 4 steps really in TfL's role of managing the system. Here they are. You have to understand requirements, which means understanding customer priorities. You have to plan how you're going to meet those requirements by providing a network and setting quality standards and organising someone to run the services. Then you have to deliver it, in London's case, through private sector contracts, and you need to set up a system so that you get the outcomes you want from that delivery. And finally, of course, you have to review and feedback and see how that's changed requirements. How does data get involved in all of those requirements? Well, in London, we look at the customer satisfaction data and try and understand what most motivates people to use the services. You look at what the stakeholders, your local and national governments, your users, groups, and so on are telling you. And you look, of course, at what the customers are feeding back to you. In planning, you need various information, including the loadings on the vehicles and the passenger journey patterns. In delivery, you need to know how you're doing, how reliable are the services, what services didn't run and why, and how much is it costing. And for review, you need rapid reporting of the outcomes. That needs to be fed back early and meaningfully to the operators so they can adjust to your requirements. And you need to agree what those requirements are and what the actions are. So taking those steps, step 1, customer requirements. What is it that most drives customer satisfaction? Well, in London, we looked at this. This is from a while ago, but it's still valid. And we did this every year. We would always research how satisfied people were with the services they just used. And we'd ask them not only how overall satisfied they were, but how satisfied they were with things like the time it took, their safety, comfort, crowding, and so on, reading up the left-hand side of that chart. Always, the time taken dominated the others. It was always the most important driver of overall satisfaction. No surprise, but good to know that your research can confirm it. Time taken. And I find this is generally true. I've seen this similar thing from many cities now. And here's one I've been involved with previously, Manila. They call the things differently there. They ask what dissatisfied you. Too few services, takes too long, uncomfortable, too expensive, all the things you'd expect. And as in London, it's the things that are related to time that cause the most dissatisfaction. You've got to get the time factors right above all else. Step 2, planning. How are you going to base this on what you know about the customers and their requirements? Well, the way we did it in London was to have a set of bus service planning guidelines based on customer requirements. We aimed to provide a network that met these 5 criteria. It would be comprehensive, serving all areas all week. It would be legible. You would be able to understand it without having to do lots of research. It would be predictable. The travel times would be of low variation, including the waiting time and the on-bus time. It would be frequent where possible. You wouldn't need to use a timetable. The buses would just be running so that you could turn up and go rather than having to research it. And it would be optimized. You would be changing it all the time to respond to changes in the patterns of travel and the patterns of land use. And the third step, same thing. Coming from what we know about what satisfies customers from our research and data there, how do we design contracts? Well, in London, we chose to have contracts that met these characteristics. They were a form of gross cost contracts, so TfL keeps the revenue, the operator is paid for the service. But it was a gross cost plus because there was a graduated payment scale based on reliability achieved against targets with a simple incentive structure. And if you made a performance above the target, you would receive a bonus. If you performed below the target, you would make a deduction. And if you were exceptionally good, you could have a 2-year contract extension at your choice. So it was a balanced system with not only operators being penalized or having deductions for things they didn't do, but also getting bonuses for things they did above the minimum standard. And this meant that the operators had to be always on the ball about keeping their services running reliably, because the thing that was incentivized was reliability, and still is. So the data in action. These are just going to be examples of the kinds of data we used. So on the left here, about passenger volumes from the ticketing system, we had long-term views about how many people were using each service. That's for one route on 3 different days of the week, weekdays, Saturdays and Sundays. From the ticketing system, from the smart card system, collected, processed and made available to service planners on their desktops. And similarly, how the services were running in terms of kilometers. On the right are the same 3 day types showing the bus kilometers run and the bus kilometers supposed to be run, very close in the case of this route. It ran very well. For origin destination information and loadings, we would carry out a manual survey over many years using the card on the left, critical for understanding what happened when we would change the network. And we would carry out a roadside loading survey at the busiest points on the route to find out whether we were supplying enough capacity. This went on over decades, and it came to be replaced with information from the smart cards. In London, you tap onto a bus, but you don't tap off, so we didn't know where you're getting off. But we could infer where you're getting off from your subsequent use of the card using 3 simple rules. The rules in the diagrams on the left show that if we know where you got on and then you use the subsequent mode, another bus, for example, or a railway, we would know where you got on that as well. So we could infer where you got off the first bus. And by doing this kind of inferencing, we were able to work out for about 3/4 of all the boardings where the alighting might have taken place to some reasonable degree of accuracy, which we checked against our card survey. And by doing that, we were able to reduce the manual survey and get much more up-to-date data. And then we combined some of this data. So we would take the information on who was on the buses and how many people were on each bus at a given moment, and look at information we had about the capacity of the buses. Various different bus types in London. We had full data on the capacity of each individual vehicle. With that, we could produce a chart like the one on the right, which shows what the percentage occupancy is on successive journeys, reading across on a single route, proceeding along the route, reading down, and color-coded, obviously, to show where it was busiest. And that helped in targeting our spending on capacity, a critical matter for public transport planning. Quite difficult to produce because we were combining 2 data sets that had grown up from different traditions over the years. The occupancy data comes, of course, from capacity and demand. The demand data from the ticketing system, the occupancy data from the infrastructure, the capacity data from the infrastructure database. Combining the 2 involves some work. And we also used combined data from the ticketing system and the AVL system to produce an estimate of how long it was taking people to travel through their entire journey, including their weight, shown here in red, an allowance for irregularity called the wait time buffer, shown in brown, the time spent on the vehicle, shown in blue, an allowance for variability in that, the buffer, an allowance for crowding, and if an interchange took place, the small yellow sliver at the top. And this is now monitored by TfL for the network as a whole to keep an eye not only on how long people are waiting, but how long it's taking them to travel through the system. Another example of combining data for cost-benefit purposes. We could take data on cost from a model we calibrated over the years based on pricing from the operators, so that we knew as well as the operators did what things should cost, and our demand model, which was based on the loadings data I've shown you already, and bring those two together to show that if we spent some more money on capacity, say, how would it change the demand? We had a spreadsheet model to do quick cost-benefit appraisals, which is part of our mission to optimize the network and keep it optimized. That's an extract from the cost model on the left there, showing the level of detail we were going into. And the things were combined to produce on the right-hand side, shown by the circle on this, a benefit to net cost ratio, even for simple things like changing the frequency of a bus route. And that way we could see that if we had a choice for a certain amount of money to spend, whether it should be spent on route A or route B, should it be spent on extending the network here or protecting the reliability of the service there, these choices could be made dynamically. It was also very important to understand lost kilometers, but services didn't run due to traffic congestion, buses not being ready, or engineering, or staff not being available. And those quantities are shown in the chart on the right, and that goes back to 1990 and up to 2013. It's carried on since then, showing how around the time of the formation of TfL, in the middle of the chart, there was a lot of service not being run because there was no staff, no driver to drive the bus. And so we therefore targeted within TfL quite deliberately staff recruitment by the operators, and it drove down the staff lost kilometers very quickly, as you can see there. So that's an example of data lost kilometers being turned into information. This chart enabling the management to prioritize an action, get more staff to have a good outcome for passengers, as shown by the declining level of staff lost kilometers. The contracts in London are at route level. So there's a framework agreement, which is all the common parts that apply to every route. And then there are individual route agreements, about 650 shown on the right, which are tendered cyclically. So the London network is not tendered on a franchise basis, it's tendered on a route basis. And each route contract lasts for 5 years, could be extended to 7. And there's a batch of new offers for tender issued every 2 weeks. So it's a rolling basis, which means that some part of the network is always under review from a reliability, a commercial, or a network provision point of view. In conclusion, these measures had a significant impact on quality. Excess weight, shown on this chart, is a key measure of service reliability. It means how much longer you wait than you're supposed to, according to the timetable. So the higher this chart is, the worse the quality. And over the years, as we change contract types, you can see that this indicator changed. When gross cost contracts were first introduced in London in the 1980s, after a little while, there was a steady improvement in reliability, as you can see by the line going down in the middle of the chart. Then net cost contracts were tried for a short while, which means the operator keeps the revenue to try and incentivize them for customer service. It didn't work. The reliability actually got worse. And then the contract type I've just described was brought in at around 2001, the quality incentive contract, and it had an immediate impact on reliability because it incentivized, it went down, got a lot better, and then has stabilized at around 1 minute since then. So in conclusion, some things to avoid with data, in my experience. Data ownership too dispersed. For example, bus operators choosing their own schedule systems makes it difficult then for you to produce the kind of information that I've shown you here today. Automatic vehicle location systems where you don't own the data can be very expensive then to produce reports from that valuable source of data. You can't get the information from the data, or it's too costly. Secondly, data are uncontrolled. For example, where you want the ticketing system and the vehicle location system to talk to each other, you've got to be sure that what's called a bus stop by one name in one system is the same bus stop by another name in the other system. There's got to be some control. It's hopeless without that. And there have to be change control plans for these databases, and somebody's got to keep them up to date. That's often overlooked, I find, that it costs money to keep these things up to date. And thirdly, and most importantly perhaps, data and information are not the same thing, and converting data into information and its cost in time and money is often underestimated. It's assumed that because you know where every bus is through the AVL system, you can do something about it. You can't until you produce some information from that data. So what are early priorities for cities, in my view, in managing good public transport? Well, customer feedback is perhaps the first thing to know about, preferably being reported monthly and classified by type. What are people complaining about? If you don't know what's wrong, you can't fix it. And it's free information, almost. Causes of lost service, I've shown you that bus kilometre chart. Again, you can target things that are going wrong if you know why they're going wrong. Quantified service reliability, it doesn't have to be excess wait time, it could be on-time performance. But because the passenger's priority is time, knowing how reliable the services are is critical, and it needs to be known frequently, at least monthly, by the system manager, and it needs to be actionable at route level. And quantified occupancy, it doesn't have to be from the ticketing system, it could just be people standing aside of the road until you get organised on the data from the ticketing system. But knowing if you've got enough capacity is critical. So those are the 4 things I would start with if there was nothing in place already. And a way of working, I've talked briefly about open data. Sharing information widely is important. And that's all my remarks. Thank you.
Thanks, John. It was a very informative presentation, and I'm sure participants have learned a lot from it, especially the ideas on data point that should be aggregated to generate value for the day-to-day operations, and especially for the commuters. Now, I would request everyone to use the live chat feature. They can actually just send us their questions or post any of the questions that you want to Barry to answer them, or they can also be specific to the Smart Move challenge as well.
So I have some questions to John, which I may, if you allow me to ask, because.
Yeah. Go on, Sharon.
Yeah, thanks, Abhishek. So John, very interesting presentation in terms of, how you have used the data in terms of addressing various issues in terms of buses. So important thing while we plan for a bus transport system or a transit system is the first mile and the last mile connectivity trip. So this is an area where most of the city falling short when they plan for their transit system. So how, while planning for a transit system in London, you have actually taken care of first mile connectivity and last mile connectivity?
Thank you, Shailendra. Yes, it's not always an easy thing to do, and London had an advantage in single agency control of all the modes. So TfL had responsibility for provision of all the modes, and therefore it was easier to implement. Where you have to get interagency collaboration, which I'm well aware is quite frequent, not necessarily easy. Secondly, we also had the advantage of a unified ticketing system and the what was known as the Oyster product, and still is in London. One of the things that TfL did outside the bus field was it negotiated with national government to make sure that that ticketing facility was fully extended to the suburban services of the National Railway. Now, those had typically been provided under a franchise arrangement with the national government Department for Transport, and it wasn't always possible for people to use their Oyster card to its fullest extent on those services. And so there was some inefficiency in people's journeys, particularly in South London, where the dominant public transport modes are suburban rail and bus rather than tube and bus. So having ticketing interavailability is critical. And thinking about walking, very important for buses, of course, because every bus journey involves walking at some stage. So we had a program to make sure that there were criteria for the layout of bus stops to make them accessible and usefully located. And I think this can often be overlooked, particularly in cities that don't have the benefit of overview of both service provision and infrastructure. But of course, if you have to wait for your bus on a very, very busy highway that you've had to cross at an uncontrolled crossing point to reach the bus stop, you are likely to be deterred from using that if you have the choice of driving. Whereas if your bus stop is located in a place that's easily accessible on foot and feels well protected from the elements and from the noise of traffic, for example, you are much more likely to use it. So I would say join up between agencies, join up on ticketing, and careful consideration of bus stop accessibility.
Okay. See, thanks. So to continue with the question, I think my next question you have partly answered. So my next question to you will be, if you look at transit system modes, you have multiple mode like rail or buses or shared taxis or other things. So what happens in case of Indian cities where we don't have a one operator model? The modes compete with each other. So when we build an integrated transit system around this whole city, so what is your take that, how we should consider these multiple mode in a manner so that these modes complement each other rather than compete with each other?
Okay. Well, as you said, some of the answer is the same as my previous answer about the benefits of agency cooperation and a ticketing system. Other factors are that you have to consider it from a passenger perspective. So sometimes it will make sense for a bus service to run alongside a railway service. Other times it won't. We have in London a metro system where, particularly in the suburban areas, the stations are quite far apart. And in the central area, the stations are deep underground on most of the lines. So in those instances, there is a role for a bus service to be running in the same general direction as the railway. It might take people to the next station along the railway when it's too far to walk, or it might take people for short trips above ground when to go below ground is too far down to make your short trip. But in other cities, it would make sense to withdraw the bus service from those areas, typically where the metro system has closer space stations and the stations are not so deep underground. So that's one key difference, for example, between London with its deep, far-spaced metro stations and Paris, central Paris, with its stations that are not very far underground and much closer together than the tube stations in London. So in Paris, the year before last now, they did a big reorganization in the central area to somewhat reduce bus movement in the central area. And their objective there was to take the savings and spend them on enhancing the suburban bus services where there was no rail. So the key part of the answer to the question is, don't always assume you can do it from a map, because sometimes it makes sense and sometimes it doesn't to have buses running alongside trains. But look at it from a passenger perspective and think, will the passenger need a choice here, or should I only provide one mode here so I can use the money I save on that mode, the other mode, to provide connections in other parts of the network?
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, this is really good. And the third question, which is my favorite question, whenever I meet any expert, and so I generally ask, in COVID-19 scenario, the most hit sector within cities is urban transport, the public transport, basically. So the cities are taking initiative in terms of building back the transit system in a manner. Financial incentives are given. Some cities are doing some technology, innovation and intervention to ensure that the passenger and the crew feel safe. So what London has done in order to, come back to the transit system, what was your experience like? How hard the transit system in London hit because of COVID-19 crisis, and now with the second wave also coming up with the new variant, and we don't know for how long this COVID-19 will go on, but the city has to run. So what is your experience, or what is the London city experience in terms of what, as an operator or as an authority or as a technology provider, people are here to suggest some solution. So what London is doing from which we can learn and get some ideas out for Indian cities?
Thank you. Yes, well, as you said, the second wave or the third wave is hitting hard here in London at the moment, and I'm sure other people have had similar experiences. It seems to me that, and it's fairly obvious, that the most important thing is the confidence of the public to use the service. So that's got something to do with where we are in the medical front, where is vaccination and so on. Something to do with the messaging that comes from government, local government and national government. Is it safe to use the public transport service? Those messages need to be quite clear. Obviously, they need to be right and appropriate, but clear as well. Early on in the pandemic, there was a message to avoid public transport in London, which wasn't necessarily the right message, I think. And how can we help with that confidence through what we do as public transport providers? Well, I think one thing that will be important in the future is people will want to know how crowded is this vehicle going to be? And already in the UK, operators are trying to provide people with information in advance about how crowded they might expect a bus to be or a train. At the moment, currently, right now, they're not very crowded because of the lockdown, but during the period in the autumn and the summer of last year, when confidence was rising again and the pandemic was in recession, there was some crowding. And we can do things with technology to give people advanced information about how crowded the vehicle is. It's quite a hard thing to do. It's a simple thing to say, quite a hard thing to do. The one city where I've seen it done well is Singapore, where they have tap on and tap off from the vehicles. So they don't have to do complicated inferencing to work out how many people are on a given bus, and they can tell you. And in the past, they've used it to advise people when there is some unreliability, that they can wait for the next bus to come because it's got space on it, which is not something you can know immediately at the stop. So information about vehicle occupancy, I think, is something that the people involved in data science and joining databases together could focus on quite well, because it's something that people are very well aware of as a requirement. But I've not actually, apart from that one example, seen it done very well, particularly as most cities, if they have a smart card system at all, only have the tap on part, not the tap off part, making it hard to know how many people are actually on the vehicle. Other things that you can use to build confidence, of course, are all the usual stuff about the hygiene on the buses and making sure that people know how well you clean them. I think there's also an opportunity that arises from the current trials and tribulations, which is that because the financial stream, the income has been hit so hard for public transport providers, with the leverage that comes from providing the subsidy, there's a chance for cities to say, well, how long is the future where we have to carry on providing subsidy for these networks? While we're doing that, should we be taking an overview about where our money is being spent? So on areas that were previously outside the view of the public agency because they were running on a financially self-sustaining basis, is an opportunity to say, well, how long will that be the case in the future? And so without recommending, because it would depend on your circumstances, that people should be taking over what were currently previously commercially run services, maybe that's not the right thing to do. There's certainly a chance to take stock from a network provision point of view and to start thinking about things that you raised in your other question, Shailendra, about unnecessary competition. Why are all these services running here? If we're paying for this anyway, shouldn't it go here instead, where we need it to support a new building or a new school or a new development? So there's an opportunity to look a little bit ahead. And finally, I'd say on this, I think that public transport will still have a strong role. It's unavoidable. Because if we want sustainable, compact cities, we have to have something like the kind of public transport, high occupancy vehicles, trains and buses and trams that we've known over the past 100 years or so. This need won't go away. It will come back, and we should be planning for it now. We shouldn't give up on that.
Yeah. Thanks. I met with one of the cities in India recently. They have on their crowding app, what you're saying, what they've done, they have actually made the mobile application when you enter into a public transport mode, and then using that app, they were actually, putting the crowd. So for example, if you are taking a bus and if your boarding pass or the ticket color is green, so that means it's safe to go. There is no crowding. If the color is, say, orange or yellow, so it is, some level of crowding is there. Red means please avoid. So this is an experiment they've done. So it's happening at the pilot phase at this moment in the city in Kolkata in India. So I'm
Very good.
sure, yeah, this kind of things or these innovative technologies in order to build the confidence of user would be required, and these kind of solutions we are actually inviting as part of this wider challenge.
Yes.
Yeah. So we have 9 more minutes to go for the session. So maybe we can quickly take a couple of questions from the audience as well. So you will see the questions on your screen, but I'll read them out for you. So this is Nandan. He says that what do you suggest regarding the integration of para transit with city bus services, which is the major issue in India?
Okay. Paratransit, so small vehicles often operated by small entities and not necessarily coordinated with the network. That's my understanding of paratransit. Usually, in the places I've been involved with this, there is a need for coordination and in some cases consolidation of those services, because usually the benefits of a bespoke service that goes near to where people live and has, if you like, a more personal relationship between the users and the driver does not offset the congestion caused by the vehicles and the lack of ability to provide network information, which is often a corollary or a concomitant situation with paratransit. I think, therefore, that the issues are not really about technical service planning. They're more about the sociology and the dynamics of relationships with the owners and operators of these vehicles. And one thing that was happening in Manila, I wasn't directly involved, was something very much like this, where there's a very large paratransit service called Jeepneys in Manila. And the government there introduced a program whereby the operators could buy into cheap loans in order to modernize their vehicles. Their vehicles are very old and very polluting, and the government designed a program where they could buy into cheap, even electrified vehicles, also of small scale, to carry on serving some of the narrow areas and giving the really fine network connectivity that paratransit can give, but to government standards. And the government had to balance the guaranteeing of the loans against mandating what the operators had to do. And they've had some success there. So a modernization of the paratransit service has been taking place there. So I offer those two thoughts. In some cases, it just makes sense to have buses instead. But that can go very wrong, as you know, from this sociology and the politics and the economic viability of the paratransit operators obviously has to be considered. So we can't just give a technical solution, but sometimes it's the right technical answer. In other cases, modernizing, as they've been starting to do in the Philippines, by, in that case, bringing up the quality of the vehicles and thereby introducing some level of control of quality and standards, would be another avenue.
Thanks for answering that. We have another one. I'll project that as well. So this is from Belaso. For country like India, won't non-technical issue like road quality hamper perspectives of electric vehicle success?
Well, I imagine that's true. I should say I'm not an engineer, but I can tell you that in London, the thing that was slowest at first was the power supply. So it wasn't the ability to get an electric bus, as we all know, there's plenty of them available. It wasn't really the ability to set them up in depots with charging points and so on. It was simply getting enough electricity into those depots to power them up. And so the big issue at the start in London was the working with the electricity supply companies. So I don't know the conditions in India, but I wouldn't be very surprised at all if that was the biggest issue there as well.
Yeah. So I have a question of my own. So like while working with the Smart Cities mission, we typically see that when we ask cities for any sort of data, just imagine, for example, like real-time data of any public transit agency, they are skeptical about releasing this data because they think that something wrong might go, like something wrong might happen and people might misuse this data. What's your experience like TFL? I know that they have been releasing a lot of data in the open domain. Can you give us any instance or any suggestion to the cities in terms of that whether it is good or bad, or how do you balance these things out? How do you make sure that the data is not misused? If it is misused, how can you take care of that particular scenario as well?
Yes. Well, first of all, I'd say that, as I said on one of the slides, I very much recommend an open data approach, because if you take some small and controlled risks with the things you've mentioned there, like misuse or so on, you can get very big benefits. So in London, an open data approach was adopted quite early on, and the products that everybody knows came out of that were the journey planners. People may have heard of people like Citymapper and so on. So they all provided rather more quickly than TfL would have done it, because they were done by these small, in the early days, startup businesses who had a passion for their area and were providing products that they constantly updated. So those products rapidly swept into the market. I said in 2017, TfL did a research report. You can find it on their website. It's called the Deloitte report, that showed 42% of people were using one of those open data-based apps for journey planning. And they made an estimate of about £90 million a year of travel time savings to people, because the question for TfL was, if it's so valuable, why aren't we charging people for it? But there's a chicken and egg thing there, which is it wouldn't have happened unless the data had been made available in the first place.
Yeah.
And TfL, over the years, again, this is not directly my area of expertise, but I've had contact with it quite a lot. They developed safeguards against misuse through setting up and actively encouraging what they call their API. It's an open data API. So there's a forum and a website where you can go on and you can understand what the structure of the data is. You can understand what limits TfL puts on the use of it, things like copyright of logos and so on. And you can understand where to go to ask about data inconsistencies, because, of course, as we all know, one of the big things about data is it's always got the possibility to go wrong. Even if 1% of your big data is faulty in some way, the whole lot of it can't be used properly because you don't trust any of it. Yeah. So understanding when you get a bit of rogue data, why it's rogue. So TfL is a forum where those people who might be, I don't know, sitting in their bedroom writing a new app can go on and ask the professional at TfL, what's the answer to my question? And that, of course, doesn't come free. There are people who TfL has to pay for to staff that. But they have this tradition of, first of all, open data. Secondly, letting people know via employing some staff to do it, what the rules are and how to find out if something's going wrong. I think as they go forward, they're thinking about how they could monetize some of this themselves, which, of course, there's always a commercial tension, because it's not so much the misuse, it's data is worth money. Why are we giving it away? But the London experience, going back now 20 years, is there was a flood of very useful applications brought about by open data that caused people to feel more confident and happier about using public transport, which in the end was good for TfL. And then as you go forward, you can modify your approach. If you want to hold back certain amounts for commercial purposes, do so. But I think having the data out there and open is really important. And I'll say one other thing, which is that because data depends on its cleanliness for being useful, well, there's nothing better than having a load of people clean it for you for nothing. So I would take the plunge, would be my view.
Yeah. Thanks for answering that. We have a question regarding the challenge itself. Shalin, would you take that? So I'll project that as well.
Yes, please.
Yeah. In the second category, whether a team of interdisciplinary academicians will be eligible without any students? That's the question.
Yeah, so we have two categories of challenge. One is the student category, where the students are required to submit their note. The second category is for professionals. So if you are an academic, so you can apply under the professionals category. So within professional category also, you can apply either as an organization or either as a group of individual, professionals, by teaming up with multiple sector specialists or multiple organization. If you want to build a team with multiple organizations, you can also build a team. So we are pretty much flexible, because the whole idea is to get some kind of innovative, solutions to these solutions. So we are not very, very bureaucratic or administrative in terms of participation. But yes, the only thing is that you cannot participate under the students category. You please participate under the professionals category.
Thank you. John, is it okay if we can take one more question? I know it is already the closing time.
That's fine.
Yeah, okay, last one then. Yeah, so thanks, John. Can you talk a bit about role of accessibility in overall network planning and what tools could be used to measure accessibility by transit agencies, especially in Indian context?
Okay, so I'm assuming that Narendra here means accessibility in terms of how close the network gets to people, where they live and where they want to go, rather than accessibility in terms of physical accessibility for people with a mobility impairment. In planning the bus network in London, we used a very simple approach over many years, which was that we set as one of our criteria that we were aiming to bring as many people as possible within about 5 minutes walk at average speed of the bus network, which is about 400 meters width. And so we would quite simply take the national census data and combine it in a GIS with our network maps to determine for any given area we were reviewing where there were pockets of residents who didn't benefit from network accessibility at that level. And we would explicitly aim to reconfigure the network in those areas in order to reduce the number more than 5 minutes away from the network. Now, this isn't always possible because it might be too expensive. It might be that the roads aren't suitable, lots of cul-de-sac, or roads are too narrow. It's informal housing maybe in a city and you can't get the buses into the places where people live. But certainly our very simple approach was fruitful, because nearly everybody in London now is within, I think, 8 minutes walk of a bus service. And those that are less than 8, but more than 5, are those living in the areas where we can't provide a bus service because it's too narrow, it's too expensive, not enough people, and so on. So quite simply, using the national census and the GIS. Now, TfL has more sophisticated tools than that as well to do analyses of accessibility for land use planning purposes. So part of the statutory planning requirement in UK, in London, is that a developer must be able to say what the public transport accessibility level of the site they are proposing to develop is. And that's on a scale of 0 to, it's not 10, 6, I think. And they won't be allowed to develop to a certain density if the public transport accessibility level is, say, 1, and they have no plan to move it up to, say, 3. So that's a standardized system that was agreed between TfL and the London boroughs who run the planning system for development. And there are well understood approaches by developers, about how to work out, they call it a PTAL, public transport accessibility level, and what kinds of things might be done with the public transport network to improve the PTAL. So I would recommend that if that doesn't exist wherever you are, that you negotiate with the city planners about using that. And you could look to TfL's PTAL system, which is publicly available, at least in outline, to show how it might be done. So 2 things. Use your national census, that's obvious, put it with your GIS, have a target for accessibility of your public transport system, work towards it over a number of years. And secondly, have a standardized system agreed with planning authorities and developers about how to define the accessibility level of every area in your city.
Thank you. We have a lot more questions, but we are actually out of time. It's already closing time now. So I would like to thank you for the workshop. It was an amazing session. Shailendra, do you want to say a few things on the closing note?
Yeah, thank you, John. Thanks, Abhishek. See, fantastic talk. What I could get from your talk is basically 3 things. An efficient public transport system means it is frequent, so that you don't need to look at the timetable. That is something, the favorite thing I like about it. You don't need to look timetable. So whenever you go within your acceptable level of service, you can get the bus. Second, it should be predictable so that you don't need to worry about whether I could reach your destination within that period of time. And third is comfortable so that you can actually get a comfort of using your private vehicle. So these are the three things I can take from this talk, and we are looking for solutions which basically help us in building the transit system or building an integrated transport system by having a kind of these three things. And then especially as a result of COVID-19, how the cities could actually address the problem which public transport system is facing. So this is another area where John touched upon the crowding app. So something like that, which would basically help the user feel comfortable while taking the public transit system. So this is another area which we would actually want our participant to suggest the solution on this area. So with this note, I would thank John and Abhishek, both of you, to have all of us on this particular talk, and thank you for all the participants who could join the talk. So thank you everyone, and take care.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Shailendra.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Thank you very much, everyone.